Welcome to Earth Analyst, where tonight we explore what life was truly like during ancient Greece, a land of olive groves, marble temples, and bustling marketplaces, yet also of hardship, struggle, and survival. As you listen, allow your mind to wander back across the millennia, drifting gently into the world of philosophers, farmers, warriors, and dreamers. This is your quiet journey through history, told in calm and soothing tones, perfect for rest and reflection. Life in ancient Greece was a mixture of brilliance and hardship, philosophy and labor, beauty and struggle. For the ordinary citizen, each day began with toil, farmers tending rocky fields, shepherds guiding flocks over sun-baked hills, and craftsmen shaping marble and clay into works that would endure for millennia. The Greek world was both awe-inspiring and unforgiving. Its landscapes dotted with bustling city-states, quiet olive groves, and rugged mountains where life was often a constant negotiation with nature. The Greeks were a people of extremes. On one hand, they built magnificent temples and developed complex political systems. On the other, they faced relentless challenges, poor harvests, disease, and the constant threat of war. From the bustling streets of Athens to the disciplined barracks of Sparta, life demanded resilience and adaptability. Sparta, above all, embodied the ideals of martial rigor. From birth, Spartan males were prepared for a life of military service. At 7, boys were taken from their families and trained in the harsh AGI system, enduring physical hardships, minimal rations, and rigorous discipline designed to forge them into elite warriors. Hunger, pain, and constant testing of courage and cunning molded them into men who would fight without hesitation. Yet the system also bred fear, suspicion, and a society in which personal bonds were subordinate to the state. Spartan women, known for their stoicism, were tasked with raising the next generation of warriors, admonishing sons to return from battle with your shield or on it. Despite the rigidity of life in Sparta, this society also demonstrated remarkable organizational strength and unity, leaving a legacy of discipline and military innovation. Athens, in contrast, pursued intellectual and artistic excellence alongside military engagement. Its streets teemed with debate, innovation, and learning, attracting thinkers from across the Greek world. Yet even Athens could not escape war and tragedy. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta brought devastation to its citizens. Food became scarce, disease spread in overcrowded neighborhoods, and even the wealthiest families experienced fear and deprivation. Thucydides recounts the horrors of plague, where bodies piled in the streets and desperation drove some to unimaginable acts just to survive. Amid this strife, the lives of slaves reveal the starkest realities of Greek society. Slavery was woven into the fabric of daily life, with people enslaved through warfare, piracy, or debt. Slaves worked in homes, fields, and workshops, and many endured the harrowing labor of the silver mines of Laurium. Here, thousands toiled in darkness, breathing toxic dust and working until exhaustion or death. Their labor funded Athens' wealth, navy, and public projects, enabling citizens to study philosophy, debate in the agora, and pursue art. Even in war, slaves rode the triremes, sustaining the military power of the city. Yet, even within this oppression, human resilience shone. Individuals like Aesop, born a slave, used wit and storytelling to transcend circumstance, ultimately earning freedom and leaving a lasting intellectual legacy. Philosophers such as Diogenes championed the dignity of the individual, living lives of radical simplicity while questioning the social hierarchy. These examples remind us that, even in darkness, the human spirit seeks freedom, dignity, and purpose. Philosophy, in particular, flourished amidst these complexities. From the early thinkers, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Parmenides, the Greeks sought natural explanations for the universe, breaking from myth and superstition. Thales proposed water as the fundamental substance of all things. Democritus envisioned a universe of atoms moving through the void. These early ideas laid the groundwork for science, logic, and metaphysics. Towering over them all was Socrates. Born in Athens in 470 BCE, he revolutionized thought through relentless questioning, exposing assumptions, and encouraging critical reflection. For Socrates, the unexamined life was not worth living, and blind obedience to authority was folly. His method, the Socratic dialogue, sought truth and virtue above all else. Though condemned to death at age 71 for impiety and corrupting youth, his teachings inspired generations, most notably his student Plato. Plato, born in 428 BCE, developed the theory of forms, proposing a realm of eternal, perfect ideals beyond the imperfect world of appearances. His work sought to guide human life toward truth, beauty, and goodness, demonstrating that the pursuit of knowledge and virtue could thrive even amidst societal hardship. The contrast between the lives of slaves and free citizens highlights the duality of ancient Greece. While philosophers debated truth and statesmen led assemblies, countless others endured labor, hunger, and cruelty. Yet these hardships formed the foundation upon which Greek culture rose. Every temple, work of art, and philosophical idea was built upon the sweat and toil of those who rarely had a voice. Slavery, while a moral stain, did not extinguish human dignity. Acts of quiet resistance, clever survival, and intellectual triumph emerged alongside suffering. Plays like Aeschylus, The Supplicants, give voice to those fleeing oppression, capturing the unquenchable desire for freedom. In their courage, we see a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As we reflect on ancient Greece, it becomes clear that life was both beautiful and brutal, demanding and inspiring. Ordinary citizens labored and survived. Soldiers fought and died. Philosophers questioned and taught, and slaves endured unimaginable suffering. Yet all together, their lives created a civilization whose achievements in philosophy, art, architecture, and governance continue to shape our world today. The story of ancient Greece is a reminder that brilliance and hardship often coexist. Freedom, dignity, and knowledge were hard-won, built upon sacrifice and labor. And as you drift into sleep, let us carry these lessons with us, that resilience, curiosity, and the pursuit of wisdom endure, even in the face of adversity. Let the lives of the Greeks, both free and enslaved, inspire our dreams of a world where all may live with dignity, freedom, and hope. Slavery has cast its long shadow across countless societies throughout history, from the towering ziggurat of Mesopotamia to the plantations of the American South. The strong have often subjugated the weak, bending them to their will. It is a shameful thread woven into the fabric of human civilization. and yet its echoes reverberate even today. Modern estimates suggest that over 40 million people worldwide remain trapped in some form of bondage or forced labor. Though the names and faces may have changed, the fundamental cruelty endures, reflecting on the grim fate of the Greek slave reminds us that history is not merely a story of triumphs and monuments, but also of unseen suffering. The only way to honor the victims of such oppression is to ensure that these horrors remain firmly in the past. In doing so, we allow ourselves to heal as a human family, bound together by empathy, compassion, and a commitment to justice. Yet, even in the shadow of suffering, the contributions of enslaved people were profound. Their labor literally greased the wheels of Greek society, enabling the city-states to flourish culturally, militarily, and politically. Would Socrates have had the leisure to ponder the nature of truth and justice without the unseen hands of slaves sustaining the city? Could Phidias have sculpted the grand statues of the Parthenon without those who mined the marble in perilous conditions? Would Athenian democracy, which inspired generations to come, have flourished without the economic foundation built on human toil? These questions are uncomfortable, yet they are essential. They force us to grapple with the moral complexity of a society that produced both sublime art and profound injustice. Yet, even amid this oppression, the humanity of the Greek slave shines through. Their dreams, hopes, and quiet acts of defiance reveal the resilience of the human spirit. Aeschylus, in his tragedy The Supplicants, gives voice to women fleeing forced marriage and enslavement, declaring, "Better to die than live a slave and suffer outrage on my body." These sparks of rebellion, however small, illuminate the unquenchable desire for freedom and dignity that resides in every human heart. Even in darkness, the human spirit finds ways to endure, resist, and leave its mark. Greek slaves were not merely victims. They were vital participants in the human story. Their sacrifices helped shape civilization itself, allowing ideas, art, and democracy to thrive. By remembering them, we reaffirm our commitment to a world where all may live free from bondage and oppression. We are reminded of the fragility and preciousness of freedom, a right hard-won through generations of struggle, one that must be protected with vigilance and care. The lives of Greek slaves were a constant negotiation with hardship. They toiled in the fields, labored in workshops, rowed warships, and descended into the perilous silver mines of Laurium. They endured hunger, harsh punishment, and relentless labor, yet their contributions allowed free citizens to debate philosophy in the agora, create art, and pursue knowledge. Their efforts were the hidden foundation of Athenian wealth, military power, and intellectual achievements. Even in the face of oppression, small acts of resistance persisted. Clever escapes, subtle defiance, and stories like that of Aesop illustrate the resilience of the human spirit. These acts remind us that even in the darkest of circumstances, hope and agency remain. The Greek slave's experience was brutal, yet it also serves as a testament to the enduring power of courage, cunning, and endurance. As we contemplate this history, we see that the story of ancient Greece is not only about towering temples and celebrated philosophers. It is equally a story of suffering, resilience, and survival. The brilliance of culture and the achievements of civilization were intertwined with hardship and moral complexity. Recognizing this duality allows us to honor both the visible and invisible contributions to human history. By remembering the Greek slaves, we connect with a deeper truth. Freedom, dignity, and justice are never guaranteed. They must be sought, protected, and cherished. The lessons of the past remind us to remain vigilant against oppression in all its forms and to celebrate the resilience that allows humanity to endure. Even amid cruelty, there are sparks of hope, acts of courage, and enduring legacies of strength. In reflecting on the Greek slave, we gain insight into the fragility and value of human freedom. Their struggles are reminders that liberty is precious, and that oppression, if left unchecked, leaves scars across generations. By honoring their memory, we commit ourselves to a world where all may live with dignity, where justice is upheld, and where the unyielding human spirit may rise, unshackled, toward a brighter future. In the face of unimaginable injustice, we can draw strength from those who endured and resisted. The Greek slaves, despite the cruelty surrounding them, demonstrated a resilience that continues to inspire us today. Their courage reminds us that dignity, compassion, and respect are values worth upholding in our own societies. Even in the darkest of times, hope and the yearning for freedom can never be fully extinguished. As we drift into slumber, let us carry with us the vision of a world where the horrors of slavery are a distant memory, where every human being can live in the warm light of justice and equality. This is a world where the Aesops and clever, the resilient, and the brave may rise to claim their rightful place as free and equal citizens. Their stories light a path forward, guiding us toward a future where oppression is confronted and compassion governs our actions. We must never forget the hard lessons of history, lest we be doomed to repeat its mistakes. The nameless millions of Greek slaves, consigned to history's pages, deserve to be remembered for their endurance, for their unyielding spirit, and for the unseen contributions that sustained an entire civilization, despite the many hardships and cruelties of life in ancient Greece. Its people left an astounding legacy that continues to echo through the ages. Their achievements in philosophy, literature, art, architecture, and governance laid the foundations of Western civilization. One of the most remarkable aspects of Greek culture was the emergence of a new way of thinking, what we now call philosophy. From the bustling streets of Athens to the quiet olive groves of Miletus, a new breed of thinkers arose, men who fearlessly questioned the nature of reality, knowledge, and the mind. The first of these philosophers is often said to be Thales of Miletus, who lived in the 6th century BCE. Thales sought to explain natural phenomena without recourse to myth or supernatural causes, boldly claiming that the fundamental substance of the universe was water. Though this notion may sound odd to modern ears, it represented a radical departure from traditional thinking. Thales introduced a naturalistic approach that would come to define Greek philosophy. Hot on his heels came other pioneering pre-Socratic thinkers like Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Democritus, each proposing radical new ideas about the universe, from Anaximenes' claim that air was the primordial substance, to Democritus' atomic theory, which held that everything is composed of tiny, indivisible particles moving through the void. These early thinkers laid the groundwork for science, logic, and metaphysics, their insights forming a foundation that would influence generations. Yet towering above them all was Socrates, often hailed as the father of Western philosophy. Born in Athens in 470 BCE to a humble stonemason and midwife, Socrates revolutionized Greek thought not by propounding doctrines of his own, but through his relentless method of questioning, the dialectic, or cross-examination. With surgical precision and sharp wit, he interrogated his fellow Athenians, exposing the assumptions underlying their beliefs and revealing how little they truly knew. Socrates was both gadfly and provocateur, dedicated to awakening his fellow citizens from complacency. He challenged conventional wisdom, deflated pompous sophists, scrutinized traditional virtues, and cast doubt on widely accepted religious practices. For Socrates, the unexamined life was not worth living, and blind obedience to authority was the height of folly. He exhorted all to think critically, question boldly, and pursue wisdom and virtue above all else. Yet, his unyielding pursuit of truth ultimately drew the ire of the Athenian establishment, leading to his trial in 399 BCE. Accused of impiety and corrupting the youth, Socrates faced death with remarkable composure. Refusing to renounce his principles, he calmly drank the hemlock, a testament to his commitment to reason and integrity. His martyrdom cemented his place in history, and his ideas lived on through his students, most notably Plato, whose philosophical system would shape Western thought for millennia. Plato's reflections on forms, ideals, and justice continue to resonate, reminding us that the pursuit of knowledge and virtue is inseparable from the human story. In contemplating the lives of these thinkers, alongside the struggles of Greek slaves, we see the duality of ancient Greece, brilliance intertwined with hardship. Slavery and oppression enabled the flourishing of culture, art, and thought, but the human cost was immense. Recognizing both the achievements and the suffering allows us to appreciate the full complexity of the ancient world. It reminds us that every great civilization rests upon the toil, sacrifice, and resilience of those often unseen, and that freedom, dignity, and justice remain ideals to protect and cherish. Socrates believed that the unexamined life was not worth living, and that blind obedience to authority and custom was the height of folly. He urged his fellow citizens to think critically, to question everything, and to pursue wisdom and virtue above all else. Yet his relentless questioning and provocative teachings proved too challenging for the Athenian establishment to bear. In 399 BCE, at the age of 71, Socrates was put on trial on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. In a profound display of philosophical integrity, he refused to renounce his views or compromise his principles, calmly accepting the death sentence and drinking the poisonous hemlock as his tearful friends looked on. Thus perished one of the noblest and wisest figures of ancient Greece. Yet his ideas and example would continue to inspire countless generations. Socrates' enduring influence is perhaps most visible in his brilliant protege Plato, a thinker who would go on to shape the trajectory of Western philosophy like no other. Born into an aristocratic Athenian family in 428 BCE, young Plato was captivated by Socrates' magnetic mind and penetrating arguments. After the master's death, Plato dedicated himself to carrying forward the Socratic vision, developing a philosophical system of remarkable breadth and depth. At the heart of Plato's philosophy is his theory of forms, the idea that beyond the shifting, ephemeral world of appearances exists an eternal, unchanging realm of perfect archetypes. For Plato, this transcendent world of forms represented the ultimate source of reality, goodness, and beauty. Every earthly object or virtue, whether a simple triangle or a lofty concept like justice, is merely an imperfect reflection of its ideal form. Plato's vision extended to governance, ethics, and knowledge, influencing not only philosophers but also rulers and citizens across generations. Through his dialogues, Plato explored the nature of justice, the soul, and the ideal society. He described a world where reason and virtue guide human actions, contrasting starkly with the struggles and injustices of everyday life in Athens. Even while contemplating lofty ideals, Plato never ignored the realities around him: the hardships of the poor, the constraints of slavery, and the turbulence of Athenian politics. His writings remind us that wisdom must always engage with the world as it is, not just as it could be. Plato's Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, became a beacon for thinkers from across Greece and beyond. Students came to study mathematics, astronomy, ethics, and philosophy, carrying the seeds of classical thought far into the future. His dialogues, such as the Republic and the Symposium, examined virtue, love, and governance, setting standards for philosophical inquiry that endure to this day. Plato's reflections demonstrate that even in a society marked by inequality, conflict, and suffering, the human mind has the capacity to reach for the eternal, to seek truth, and to imagine a more just and enlightened world. By contemplating the lives of Socrates and Plato, alongside the struggles of ordinary Athenians and enslaved people, we gain a richer understanding of ancient Greece. We see a civilization capable of extraordinary thought and creativity, yet built on the labor and suffering of many. This duality, a world of profound intellect alongside harsh reality, offers lessons that continue to resonate. It teaches us about resilience, the pursuit of knowledge, and the enduring human spirit. Even as we drift into sleep, we can reflect on how these thinkers transformed hardship into insight, how their inquiries and ideals continue to shape modern thought. The stories of Socrates and Plato remind us that despite the challenges of life, curiosity, courage, and reason can guide us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world. They illuminate the enduring capacity of the human mind to question, learn. For Plato consisted in the recollection of sublime essences, which the soul once beheld directly before its descent into bodily incarnation. Equally influential was his conception of the ideal state, outlined in the landmark dialogue, The Republic. Repulsed by the messy realities of Athenian democracy, Plato envisioned a utopian society governed by wise philosopher kingsmen of gold, specially trained in mathematics, dialectic, and metaphysics. In this carefully ordered system, each social class had a defined function. Warriors exhibited courage. Farmers and artisans supplied necessary goods, and philosopher guardians steered the ship of state in accordance with the form of the good. While many modern readers balk at the rigid and hierarchical nature of this political scheme, Plato's provocative vision continues to spark reflection on justice, governance, and the role of wisdom in society. Perhaps no philosophical topic preoccupied Plato more than the nature of love and desire. In his Symposium, a dramatic dialogue set at a raucous Athenian gathering, Plato unfolds his famed ladder of love. As articulated by the wise priestess Diotima, erotic desire for physical beauty is only the first rung on a higher ascent toward ultimate reality. By gradually redirecting longing from the physical to the spiritual, the philosophical lover is initiated into the mysteries of love itself, a force driving creativity, understanding, and moral growth. The Platonic circle embraced this notion as the intellectual heartbeat of their society, with Socratic dialectic acting as the supreme erotic of the mind. Yet, as much as Plato exalted beauty and love, his metaphysics also reflected an unmistakable aesthetic and intellectual detachmental wariness of bodily pleasures and a yearning for pure rationality. In his famous allegory of the cave, he depicts most humans as prisoners, shackled and compelled to watch flickering shadows on the wall. Only the rare philosophic soul breaks free, ascending to the surface to perceive the blinding light of the sun, the form of the good, and apprehend reality in its eternal essence. This vision of liberation, of the mind striving beyond earthly illusion, captures the soaring impulse of Greek thought, a culture wrestling with the tension between human frailty and real intellectual aspiration, where Plato soared into abstract ideals. His pupil, Aristotle, grounded philosophy in the tangible world. Born in 384 BCE in the northern outpost of Stagira, Aristotle joined Plato's academy at 17, quickly becoming the master's brightest student. Yet he was very much his own thinker, favoring empirical observation over Platonic idealism. After Plato's death, Aristotle founded his own school, the Lyceum, where he lectured on topics ranging from biology and physics to ethics, politics, and poetics. Aristotle sought to understand the world as it is, cataloging plants and animals, analyzing human behavior, and systematizing logic. His philosophy reflects the day-to-day concerns of Greek life, the natural rhythms of the environment, and the material conditions of living. From agriculture to politics, showing how deeply intellectual life was intertwined with ordinary existence. Through both Plato and Aristotle, we see the duality of Greek life, the tension between lofty ideals and concrete realities, between contemplation and survival. Even as Greeks labored in fields, mines, and workshops, their minds reached toward timeless questions about truth, beauty, and justice. Philosophy was not a luxury. It was woven into the rhythm of their cities, their courts, and their households, illuminating lives often shadowed by war, slavery, and scarcity. And yet, these thinkers remind us that even amidst hardship, curiosity and reason can endure, offering a quiet but enduring light to guide the human spirit through the complexities of existence. Aristotle possessed one of the mightiest and most capacious intellects the world has ever known. He functioned almost as a one-man university, making groundbreaking contributions to an astonishing array of fields: logic, rhetoric, politics, ethics, psychology, biology, astronomy, and more. In a remarkable feat of systematization, Aristotle took the scattered insights of his predecessors and unified them into a vast intellectual cathedral, structuring Western thought for centuries to come. At the heart of his philosophy is the notion of eudaimonia, or human flourishing. For Aristotle, the highest good is not an abstract form, as Plato proposed, but the concrete realization of our proper function as rational, social beings. We achieve eudaimonia by fully actualizing our essential nature through a life of virtue, practical wisdom, and contemplation, striking the golden mean between indulgence and austerity. The eudaimonic individual is the megalopsychos, the great soul, paragon of excellence, embodying courage, temperance, justice, magnanimity, and all classical virtues. Aristotle's ethics are grounded in the realities of human life, rooted in the struggles of politics, commerce, and society, rather than lofty abstractions. Yet he, like Plato, also saw the highest human calling in the bios theory tychos, the contemplative life, where one engages with truth, knowledge, and the eternal. In passages from the Nicomachean Ethics, he describes this life of philosophical contemplation as a godlike existence, a supreme form of happiness surpassing moral virtue alone. Aristotle's scope was breathtaking. Treatises on physics, cosmology, zoology, psychology, poetics, rhetoric, ethics, and metaphysics left almost no intellectual stone unturned. His encyclopedic synthesis created a framework that would guide philosophers and scientists for millennia, demonstrating how deeply Greek intellectual life intertwined with daily experience. Yet, while Plato and Aristotle embodied theoretical excellence, other philosophical currents pursued ethics and practical living. The Hellenistic period saw schools like the Stoics, Skeptics, and Epicureans, emphasizing philosophy as a guide to serenity and inner peace. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium in the early 3rd century BCE, celebrated the supremacy of reason, urging humans to live virtuously in harmony with nature and the cosmos. For thinkers like Chrysippus, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, happiness lies in mastering judgment and desire, understanding that external events are beyond our control. By cultivating detachment and accepting fate, the Stoic sage attains ataraxia, a freedom from disturbance, finding order and purpose even amidst war, political strife, and personal hardship. Meanwhile, skeptics charted a different course, challenging certainty itself, teaching that tranquility comes from suspending judgment, recognizing the limits of knowledge, and embracing the modesty of human understanding. These philosophies were not abstract luxuries. They were practical guides to living in a world marked by warfare, political turbulence, and social hierarchy. They helped Greeks navigate everyday life from the crowded streets of Athens to the fields and workshops of the countryside, offering tools to endure suffering, loss, and uncertainty. Even as slaves toiled in the laurium mines or citizens faced the threat of conquest, philosophical thought provided a pathway to resilience, moral clarity, and inner freedom. The Stoics and Skeptics, in particular, remind us that ancient Greece was not only a civilization of brilliant minds and monumental achievements, but also a society profoundly engaged with the challenges of human existence, seeking peace of mind and meaning amidst life's harsh realities. Imperturbability was the hallmark of the Hellenistic philosophical mindset, whereas the Stoics achieved peace through submission to cosmic reason. The skeptics attained it by suspending judgment altogether. Faced with the hopeless diversity of philosophical views and the unreliability of the senses, the wise person took no sides, adopting instead a humble attitude of non-assertion and open-minded inquiry. By embracing uncertainty and rejecting dogmatism, the skeptic avoided the psychic turmoil that plagued the opinionated masses, finding tranquility in measured detachment. Meanwhile, Epicurus of Samos taught that the most blessed life was one of modest pleasures centered around friendship, simple food, and quiet contemplation. Withdrawing from the hurly-burly of politics to cultivate his legendary garden, Epicurus saw philosophy as a soothing balm, dissolving the anxieties and fears of everyday life. Against the religious superstitions of his era, he preached an enlightened hedonism guided by prudence and moderation. Contentment, he argued, arose from tempering desire, surrounding oneself with trustworthy companions, and cultivating a cheerful, self-sufficient mind. All these Hellenistic schools shared a common concern: the ethical art of living. In an increasingly cosmopolitan and individualistic age, as the old palace-centered order crumbled following Alexander the Great's conquests, Greek philosophy turned toward the personal and therapeutic. The Stoics, skeptics, and Epicureans pioneered a vision of philosophy as a practical medicine for the soul, a regimen of spiritual exercises aimed at curing distress and attaining inner equanimity. This Greek ideal of philosophy as a guide to practical life would resonate for centuries, inspiring thinkers from Cicero to Thomas Jefferson, offering timeless lessons in resilience and moral reflection. Despite the blood, sweat, and tears that often defined life in ancient Greece, this remarkable culture birthed a philosophical tradition of astounding creativity and enduring relevance. Their passion for critical inquiry, fearless skepticism, and rational debate bequeathed an inexhaustible spring of ideas to humanity, shaping Western thought forever. Perhaps nowhere is this intellectual legacy more vivid than in the sublime corpus of Greek tragedy and comedy. From the spectacular festivals of Dionysus to the rocky stages of old comedy, the Greeks displayed unrivaled genius in dramatizing the timeless tensions of the human condition. The supreme master of Athenian tragedy was undoubtedly Sophocles, the long-lived veteran of the stage, who earned 24 first-prize victories at dramatic competitions. Born around 496 BCE into a wealthy and cultured family, Sophocles began his illustrious career at just 28, surpassing even Aeschylus himself. Over the next 6 decades, he produced immortal works such as Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus, and Antigone, chilling meditations on fate, knowledge, and power that continue to captivate audiences 2,500 years later. What makes Sophocles' plays endlessly compelling is their unflinching insight into the ironies and ambiguities of human life. At the center of his vision is the tragic hero, a larger-than-life yet profoundly human figure whose noble qualities carry the seeds of destruction. Whether it is the brilliant Oedipus solving the Sphinx's riddle only to fall into a web of parricide and incest, or the principled Antigone defying state power in the name of divine law, Sophocles' characters grapple with agonizing moral dilemmas for which there are no easy answers. These narratives remind us that even in the harsh and unforgiving world of ancient Greece, the human spirit wrestled with questions of justice, honor, and mortality, leaving lessons that echo across the ages, a vertiginous plunge into the abyss of human blindness and self-ignorance. The brash young king, so confident in his Promethean intellect, relentlessly pursues the truth of his origins, only to discover that he himself is the unwitting polluter he seeks. He who once saved Athens from the monstrous Sphinx now finds that he is the monster, a living embodiment of nature's perversity, the unclean sun husband whose very being is a violation. With savage irony, Sophocles shows how Oedipus' kingly virtues, his fierce resolve, dogged persistence, and sharp reasoning lead directly to his catastrophic downfall. Every step of his investigation only entangles him further in a monstrous web of blood and darkness, and when at last the unbearable truth comes to light, the agonized Oedipus gouges out his eyes in a futile attempt to unsee what he has seen. The great solver of riddles must plunge himself into a second darkness, for some knowledge is too terrible for human eyes to bear. It is this haunting portrait of human fragility, of our pitiful subjection to forces beyond our control, that makes Oedipus Rex such an emotionally shattering experience. Sophocles presents the human condition in all its cruel ambiguity, our vaunted intelligence and civilization forever teetering on the edge of an irrational abyss, our noblest intentions twisted into self-destruction. With austere grandeur and unsparing insight, Sophocles reveals the radical limits of human autonomy, showing how even a great and glorious king is ultimately a plaything of fate. Yet, for all the bleakness of his vision, Sophocles is no nihilist. Oedipus' suffering has a kind of terrible beauty and meaning. By unflinchingly pursuing the truth at all costs, he achieves a paradoxical heroism even in the depths of despair. There is something strangely empowering in the way Oedipus accepts total responsibility for his abominable deeds, though committed in blameless ignorance, broken and polluted though he is. Oedipus attains a strange dignity in his refusal of consolation, his granite insistence on bearing the unbearable. And though Sophocles sends his hero into a black night of misery, he also hints at a distant hope of reconciliation and redemption. In Oedipus at Colonus, the aged, exiled king wanders the earth as a lowly beggar, attended by his loyal daughter Antigone. Purified through suffering, Oedipus ultimately finds forgiveness and peace in the sacred grove at Colonus, a mystical resting place for his weary bones. The man who once plummeted from the highest pinnacle of worldly fortune discovers a hard-won spiritual wisdom, an acceptance of his role as a mortal subject to forces greater than himself. The grim fate that awaited many slaves in ancient Greece is equally hard to fathom in our modern age. Imagine, for a moment, being one of the countless souls born into bondage, your life's path predetermined to be one of hardship and servitude. The silver mines of Laurium were particularly notorious, located just south of Athens and relying heavily on slave labor to extract the precious ore that financed the mighty Athenian navy. The work was grueling and perilous, hour upon backbreaking, hour swinging pickaxes and hauling heavy loads in dark, dust-choked tunnels. Cave-ins, noxious vapors, and accidental deaths were constant threats. Those who survived still faced exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. Records tell of as many as 20,000 slaves laboring in the Laurium mines during Athens' 5th century heyday. Most were war captives, ripped from their homelands by conquering armies and cast into lives of servitude. Others fell into slavery through piracy, kidnapping, or crushing debts. All were stripped of rights and liberties, their worth measured only by the suffering their bodies could endure. Glance to your left and imagine the man shackled there in the gloom, his only crime being birth on the losing side of a war. To your right, a sickly boy, no older than 12, already broken by hunger and abuse. The stories that haunt these sunken, hopeless eyes could fill a library of human despair, yet they also reveal extraordinary resilience. Some slaves, through ingenuity, courage, or sheer stubbornness, carved moments of dignity and small triumphs amidst relentless suffering. They whispered tales, taught each other trades, or secretly nurtured hope for a better life. Their quiet acts of resistance remind us that even in the bleakest corners of ancient Greece, the human spirit could flicker defiantly against the darkness. These glimpses of courage and endurance echo through history, preserving the memory of those whose labor built civilizations yet whose names are forever lost. 1,000 histories could never fully capture the agony endured by those enslaved in places like Laurium, mining the silver that would adorn Athenian coins and fund the mighty mercenaries of the city. Yet others met a grimmer fate at sea. In times of war, thousands of unfortunate souls were pressed into service as oarsmen, powering the formidable triremes of the Athenian navy into battle. The scholar Herodotus recounts the Athenians' cruel treatment of the citizens of Milos, a neighboring city-state that had rebelled around 494 BCE. The male population was largely exterminated, while their wives and children were spared only to be sold into slavery. Herded onto ships, these captives were transported across the Aegean to live out their days in servitude. Among them was a young boy named Histios. As the city burned behind them, the wailing of the doomed filling the air, he huddled against his mother on the blood-slicked deck, bound for a life of servitude in Athens. Young Histios could only imagine the anguish and terror of leaving his home forever. Below deck, the ship pitched and rolled over the wind-dark sea, crammed with children and adults alike, their meager rations of stale bread and water barely enough to sustain life. Disease claimed the weakest, their bodies pitched overboard for the fish and gulls. Upon arrival in Athens, Histios would likely have been torn from his mother, sold to separate fates, perhaps never to see one another again. Such was the cruel calculus of slavery. Families shattered, bonds severed, and all human affection subordinated to commerce. Some slaves labored in the fields, tending wheat and olive crops. Others in workshops, producing ceramics, textiles, and other trade goods. For Histios, the likely fate was as a household servant, performing endless menial chores under the watchful, sometimes violent, eye of his master. He may have suffered indignities, harsh punishment for trivial errors, or the predatory gaze of those in power. And yet, even in the depths of such adversity, the human spirit endures. Zeno of Citium, born in the 4th century BCE, rose from servitude to found Stoic philosophy, teaching the pursuit of virtue, self-control, and equanimity. His resilience, born of intimate knowledge of suffering, illuminates the extraordinary potential for transcendence amidst brutality. But for every Zeno, countless others endured lives of quiet agony. Young girls torn from mothers, old men broken by decades of labor, lovers and families forcibly separated. These are the untold stories the silent testament to human suffering. Their cries echo faintly through time, carried on the wind with the clank of chains, the crack of whips, and the muffled sobs of the terrified and innocent. In sleep, one might hear them still, a chorus of misery that stretches across millennia, too vast and terrible to fully comprehend. Yet even within this darkness, moments of courage and endurance, flickers, small acts of defiance, whispered words of hope, secret teachings passed among captives, and the indomitable will to survive. These faint lights remind us that even in the bleakest conditions, the human spirit refuses to be extinguished, and so we return to the beginning, to the fundamental truth that life in ancient Greece, for all its vaunted philosophy and politics, was a brutal and unforgiving affair for the vast majority. A world where the strong prospered through the sweat and blood of the weak, where the vagaries of fortune could see a prince reduced to a pauper in the space of a day, a free woman enslaved for the crime of being on the losing side of a war. Perhaps that is what puts the achievements of the Greeks into their proper context, that it was a society so riven by oppression and adversity, and yet capable of such towering heights of intellect and inquiry, that for all the centuries of subjugation, that ineffable spark of curiosity and ingenuity could not be quenched in the Hellenic spirit, that from such pain and hardship, such light and beauty could still emerge. So let us spare a thought for the lonely, huddled wretch in the bowels of a slave ship, for the starving miner choking in the dust of Laurium, for the battered servant toiling thanklessly in the heat of the day, for it is on their scarred and broken backs that the glittering edifice of Greek civilization was built. And in the end, when the columns have crumbled to dust and the last echoes of the epics have faded from memory, it is their struggles and their sacrifice we must strain to recall. These vanished multitudes who lived, suffered, and died in the shadow of the Acropolis, for theirs is the truest, most enduring history of ancient Greece. Despite the cruel realities of daily life, ancient Greeks also managed to find moments of joy, beauty, and meaning amidst the struggle. Festivals and religious rituals provided occasional respite from the hardship, bringing the community together in shared celebration. One of the most famous examples were the great Dionysia, held each spring in Athens to honor the god Dionysus. For a few precious days, the city's poets, actors, and playwrights took center stage, mesmerizing audiences with their performances. At times like these, even poor farmers and slaves could bask in leisure and revelry, enjoying wine, dance, and beloved fables brought to life. The renowned playwright Sophocles crafted some of his masterpieces for these festivals, including the timeless tragedies of Oedipus Rex and Antigone. With their soaring poetry and piercing insights into the human condition, these stories offered catharsis and meaning to a populace who knew all too well the cruelty and chaos of the world. While few could ever hope to attain the sublime artistry of such masters, the Dionysia inspired an appreciation for theater and storytelling that permeated Greek society. Even in small villages, local bards and minstrels regaled the public with tales of gods and heroes around the campfire. These myths, passed down through generations, helped the Greeks make sense of their harsh existence. They wove a rich tapestry of meaning that elevated the mortal experience and gave the people an identity beyond mere survival. For example, Consider the famous tale of Persephone, the goddess of spring growth, and her annual return from the underworld. This beloved myth helped explain the turning of the seasons. Persephone, emerging from the land of the dead each spring to bring the earth back to life, only to return below again in winter. For farmers toiling away under the scorching Mediterranean sun, the story of Persephone was a glimmer of hope, a rhythm of renewal that reminded them that suffering was not endless, and that life, like the seasons, could always return to light. It taught resilience, patience, and the beauty of cyclical life. Parents would whisper her story to their children as they labored in the fields, passing on lessons of endurance, change, the cosmos. It imbued their struggles with profound spiritual purpose. The myths also provided moral instruction and cautionary examples to guide the Greeks in their daily lives. The Odyssey, Homer's epic poem, told of the heroic Odysseus and his long, perilous journey home after the Trojan War. Along the way, he had to outsmart deadly threats like the monstrous Cyclops, Polyphemus, and resist temptations like the bewitching Song of the Sirens. To the Greeks, Odysseus embodied the virtues of cunning, fortitude, and faithfulness that they all needed to navigate life's hardships. His story inspired them to keep enduring and striving, no matter what the gods or fate threw their way. These myths weren't just idle entertainment. They were a survival tool, a way to find courage and wisdom in the face of a bleak, unpredictable existence. They elevated the Greeks from mere subsistence to a people with a proud, storied heritage and identity. And at festivals like the Dionysia, that heritage was constantly renewed. The old tales revisited and reinterpreted by each new generation of poets and playwrights. Good fortune in life. The Greeks believed that their deities controlled every aspect of the world, from the weather to the outcome of battles. They lived in constant awe and fear of the gods, knowing that any moment their wrath could bring ruinous misfortune down upon their heads. To appease these powerful but fickle beings, the Greeks performed endless sacrifices and rituals according to precisely detailed rules and traditions. During festivals, the blood of oxen, goats, and sheep flowed freely as offerings to Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, and the rest of the sprawling pantheon. Altars smoked with burning meat and incense as priests chanted sacred hymns. Before marching off to war, Spartan soldiers always sought divine approval with solemn rites and sacrifices. Many festivals were joyous, colorful affairs that offered a chance to cut loose and revel in earthly pleasures. Dancers whirled to vibrant music, while acrobats and jugglers performed to the delight of the crowds. Lively processions wound through the streets, with participants dressed as satyrs, nymphs, and other mythical beings. It was a time to cast off the weary burdens of everyday life and indulge in merriment and spectacle. Even the great thinker Aristotle argued for the importance of such festivities, which he called one of the highest forms of human activity. Of course, not everyone got to partake equally in these celebrations. They often reinforced the rigid hierarchies of Greek society, with seating and participation carefully regulated by class and status. Women were mostly excluded from public revelry, confined to the domestic sphere, while these respites from the daily grind offered hope and relief. Too many Greeks, they couldn't erase the underlying brutality and inequity that plagued their world. Behind every extraordinary work of art or moment of merriment, lay the mundane suffering that defined life for most people, the backbreaking labor, the constant specter of war and disease, the oppression of women, and the wretched exploitation of slaves. This was the bleak canvas on which the Greeks painted their moments of light. And inevitably, each festival had to end, the music falling silent, the crowds dispersing, the beautiful costumes packed away, farmers returning to their fields, soldiers to their barracks, women to their looms, and slaves to their labors. Yet, the memories of those experiences and the myths, traditions, and beliefs they renewed helped sustain the Greeks through the unrelenting challenges of their existence. The fables of Odysseus and eternal Persephone, the prayers offered in sacred temples, of resilience. They reminded each citizen that life, for all its cruelty, also offered moments of beauty and meaning. The festivals and myths created a rhythm to life, a sense of continuity between generations. And in those brief celebrations, the Greeks glimpsed a life unburdened by suffering, a life worth striving for, even if only for a few fleeting hours, source of meaning and identity beyond mere survival. The Greeks were united by piety, heritage, and a common fate. This shared foundation allowed them to endure the cruelest turns of history with resilience and even a measure of grace. Thanks to these mythic and cultural touchstones, a Greek farmer could see his own trials reflected in the labors of Heracles and understand his place in a greater story. At the theater or the temple, a poor woman could feel herself part of something larger than her narrow, confined world, connected to the great chain of being. Hearing the heroic tales, even the lowliest slave could walk a little taller. The Greeks endured and persevered through unimaginable hardship. World was, in many ways, brutal and unforgiving. Their rich culture and unshakable spirit allowed them to rise above the constant struggle of life, asserting their humanity in the face of pain, cruelty, and chaos. In the mythic heroes and pious rituals they celebrated, the Greeks found inspiration to keep striving for virtue and glory in an uncertain world. That tenacity and resilience would fuel some of the most stunning achievements in human history, from the grand temples of the Acropolis to the groundbreaking philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. And it all emerged from the harsh crucible of a brutal existence, a testament to the sheer fortitude of the Greek people. But let us turn our focus now to a few key historical figures who exemplified both the challenges and triumphs of this unforgiving world, figures whose extraordinary lives left an indelible mark on the Greek landscape and the greater arc of history. By examining these remarkable characters, we can better understand the human element behind the sweeping currents of the ancient Mediterranean. The first of these figures is the legendary Athenian statesman and reformer Solon, born into a noble family around 630 BCE. Solon came of age in a time of crisis and upheaval for his city-state. Decades of simmering tensions between the aristocratic landowners and the increasingly impoverished peasantry had brought Athens to the brink of collapse. Farmers who had fallen into debt were being sold into slavery, while a handful of elite families tightened their grip on wealth and power. As a respected voice of moderation, Solon was appointed chief magistrate in 594 BCE and tasked with resolving this crisis before it tore the city apart. He responded with a series of bold, carefully balanced reforms that would reshape Athenian society for generations to come. First and foremost, Solon outlawed the practice of debt slavery, ensuring that no Athenian would ever again be enslaved to a creditor. He ordered the immediate release of all those currently bonded and arranged for the return of farmers who had been sold abroad. This lifted a huge burden off the backs of the common people and began to ease the simmering resentment against the wealthy elite. At the same time, Solon refused demands to redistribute land from rich to poor, likely understanding that stripping the nobles of their wealth would only destabilize the city further. Instead, he worked to create more opportunity for enterprising commoners to acquire property and advance their station through hard work and thrift. He encouraged the cultivation of olives and grapes for export, opening up new avenues for farmers to profit. Solon also made participation in civic affairs a duty for all citizens, rich and poor alike. He established a people's court where any male citizen could bring a case or serve as a juror, regardless of class. This gave the common people a greater stake and voice in the governance of their society. But he also maintained the aristocratic council of the Areopagus as a check on the power of the masses, ensuring that experienced elites still had a role in guiding the state. Perhaps most revolutionary of all, Solon changed the basis of political power from birth to wealth. He divided all citizens into 4 classes based on their annual agricultural output, with each class granted a corresponding degree of political rights and responsibilities. While still far from a true democracy, this system laid the groundwork for the eventual flourishing of Athenian civic life, balancing equity and order in a society still haunted by inequality and unrest. System allowed successful farmers and artisans to rise into positions of authority, breaking the stranglehold of the old aristocratic bloodlines. Solon's deft reforms helped release the pressure building within Athens and laid the groundwork for its later flourishing. But this great visionary was no starry-eyed utopian. He understood all too well the grimmer realities of human nature and the world around him. Laws are like spiderwebs, he once remarked. They will catch the weak and poor, but will be torn to pieces by the rich and powerful. Indeed, Solon had little illusion that life for the common Athenian would ever be anything but a harsh struggle. Even after his reforms, the lot of farmers, laborers, and slaves remained one of relentless toil and deprivation from dawn to dusk, constant conflict. But Solon's genius lay in recognizing that a society is most stable and prosperous when it gives each segment of its population some stake in the greater good, some reason to identify with the body politic. By softening the rough edges of aristocratic domination and offering the lower classes a measure of security and participation, he helped knit his polis together and invested its citizens with a deeper loyalty and fellow feeling. Solon's example would inspire Greek statesmen and philosophers for centuries to come, from Cleisthenes, the father of Athenian democracy, to Aristotle, who saw in Solon's reforms a model of moderate mixed government. His wisdom, moderation, and skillful statecraft set the tone for the best of the Greek political tradition. Solon represented the ideals of balance, restraint, and compromise in the face of social upheaval. Our next key figure embodied a very different set of values, those of unflinching martial courage and self-sacrifice. I speak of none other than King Leonidas of Sparta, the legendary warrior who led 300 of his men to glorious death against the invading Persians at Thermopylae. The story of Leonidas and his 300 has been told and retold down through the centuries. Immortalized in poetry, art, and film, it has become the archetype of the doomed but defiant last stand, the ultimate expression of the Spartan creed of honor and martial prowess. But to understand the true impact of this hero's sacrifice, we must first examine the context in which it occurred, a time of existential peril for the Greek world. The year was 480 BCE, and the mighty Persian Empire under Xerxes I was determined to conquer the divided and squabbling Greek city-states once and for all. For over a century, the Greeks had managed to frustrate the designs of the great kings through their stubborn independence and military ingenuity. But now Xerxes had assembled a massive multinational army, drawing contingents from every corner of his vast domains, determined to crush the Hellenes with overwhelming force. Ancient sources claimed this host numbered in the millions, though modern historians believe a few 100,000 is more likely. Regardless of the precise figures, it was clear that the Greeks faced an existential threat like none they had ever seen. A wave of panic and despair washed over the city-states as they grappled with the enormity of the Persian war juggernaut. Many openly considered surrender or neutrality rather than face annihilation. But the Spartans, led by their kings, Leonidas and Leotychides, took a very different view. As the recognized masters of land warfare, the legendary warrior elite saw the Persian invasion as the ultimate test of Spartan valor and discipline. Where others counseled caution, they yearned for a glorious confrontation that would ring through the ages. When a Persian envoy arrived in Sparta, demanding the ritual offering of earth and water as symbols of submission, Leonidas' reply was curt and characteristically laconic. "Dig it out for yourselves." With those words, he committed his polis to a fight to the death against the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. But the Spartans could not take on the Persians alone. They needed to rally the other city-states to put aside their squabbles and unite in common defense. Under Leonidas' leadership, they convened a Hellenic league and sent out a call for each state to muster its fighting men and meet the approaching threat. The urgency was immense. Every contingent of hoplites, archers, and light infantry counted, for the Persians' vast numbers threatened to crush the defenders through sheer weight alone. In this crucible of survival, Leonidas and his men exemplified the Spartan ideals of discipline, courage, and unwavering loyalty. They trained relentlessly, honed their weapons, and fortified the narrow mountain pass at Thermopylae, where they would turn the terrain itself into an ally. Theirs would be a stand not merely of arms, but of spirit, a defiance that would echo through history far beyond the battlefield. The response from the other Greek city-states was underwhelming, to say the least. Many dithered, bickered, and wavered in the face of the oncoming storm. Old rivalries and grievances bubbled to the surface, paralyzing collective action. Athens and Sparta nearly came to blows over which would command the allied navy and all. The while, the Persian host marched inexorably closer, subjugating or bypassing Greek settlements in its path. In the end, only a small coalition of city-states rallied to Leonidas' side, mustering a force of some 7,000 men to block the Persian advance at the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae. The Spartan king knew this position was highly defensible, but not indefinitely so. Eventually, the Persians would either break through or find a way around. But he hoped that a heroic stand might galvanize the rest of the Greeks to unite and muster a larger force to defeat the invaders. And so Leonidas led his 300 Spartans, along with contingents from Thespians and other allies, to make that stand. At the Hot Gates, for 2 brutal days, the Greeks held the pass against wave after wave of Persian assaults, inflicting massive casualties. The Spartan warriors were in their element, their lifelong training and discipline paying off as they fought in tight phalanx formation, rotating fresh troops to the front. Contemporary accounts speak of the Spartans' utter fearlessness and ferocity in this close-quarters bloodbath. Herodotus describes the heroism of Dynax, who, upon hearing that the Persian arrows would blot out the sun, remarked, "So much the better, we shall fight in the shade." Another Spartan warrior, Polydorus, was said to have slain a charging Persian cavalry officer with a single mighty throw of a stone. But on the 3rd day of battle, the Greeks' fate was sealed by an act of betrayal. A local shepherd named Ephialtes revealed to the Persians a mountain path that would allow them to outflank the pass. Leonidas, learning of this development, dismissed the bulk of the Greek forces to save them from annihilation. He and his 300 Spartans, along with a contingent of Thebans and Thespians, would remain to guard the retreat, fighting to the last man in those final hours, knowing death was certain. It is said that Leonidas turned to his men and declared, "Eat a hearty breakfast, men. For tonight we dine in Hades." Shields locked, spears bristling, they awaited the onslaught, embodying the Spartan ideal of courage in the face of inevitability. The clash was thunderous, the cries of men and clash of bronze echoing through the narrow pass. Even surrounded and outnumbered, the Greeks fought with the precision and ferocity of a single organism, a wall of defiance against the tide of empire. Each step forward, they forced the Persians to pay in blood, their sacrifice buying precious time for the rest of Greece to prepare its defenses. By the end of the day, the Spartans fell, but their legend was immortal. Stories of Thermopylae would inspire generations, a timeless testament to courage, loyalty, and the willingness to die for one's ideals. In the shadow of their valor, the rest of Greece found the courage to unite, eventually repelling the invaders and preserving the independence and culture of the Hellenic world. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his 300 men became a symbol not only of martial heroism, but of the human spirit's refusal to bow, even against impossible odds. The life of a Greek slave was one of unending toil, from the first pale light of dawn to the deep shadow of night, their hours measured in sweat, suffering, and unrelenting labor. Each swing of the pickaxe, each haul of heavy stone, each repetitive motion in the furnace or the loom was a testament not to freedom, but to endurance. In the silver mines of Laurium, men and women worked in suffocating darkness, lungs thick with dust, bones aching, their faces etched with fatigue and despair. Children no older than 10 learned to carry burdens heavier than their small frames should bear, and many would never survive to adulthood. On the crowded decks of warships, slaves pulled oars with trembling arms until blisters and blood were nothing but familiar companions. Each day was a cruel repetition, a ritual of suffering imposed without hope, without mercy, without choice. Yet, even in the shadow of such relentless oppression, the human spirit often flickered with quiet resistance. A whispered word of comfort from a fellow slave, a fleeting glance at the sky through the narrow mine shaft, a secret story passed in hushed tones at night. These small acts preserved the fragile sense of self and humanity that the world sought to strip away. In rare cases, brilliance and courage found a way to emerge from the darkness, as in the life of Zeno of Citium, the slave who became philosopher, whose mind soared far beyond the chains that bound his body. His words, teaching virtue, self-discipline, and inner freedom, were a quiet rebellion against a world designed to crush him, a declaration that the soul could remain unbroken even when the flesh was enslaved. The sacrifices of countless unnamed slaves formed the hidden backbone of Greek civilization. Without their labor, the ships that defended Athens, the grand temples that honored the gods, the vessels and workshops that supplied the cities, and even the flourishing of philosophy and art would have remained impossible. Their toil, often invisible to the chroniclers of history, was nonetheless the foundation upon which the ostensible greatness of Greece rested. The glory of the Parthenon, the elegance of Athenian sculptures, the triumphs of the Olympic Games, the victories of Armitage bore the silent imprint of the enslaved, whose suffering was the shadow beneath the shining achievements of the free. And yet, for all the cruelty, there were moments of fleeting humanity, brief glimpses of relief or compassion that reminded the oppressed of life beyond the lash. A master's rare kindness, a shared meal of stale bread, a whispered story of heroes, or the comfort of a friend huddled beside them in the dark. These small, fragile moments of hope became lifelines. Even in chains, the enslaved nurtured courage, endurance, and a capacity for inner freedom that no whip or master could entirely destroy. Their resilience was a quiet defiance, an affirmation of the unbroken dignity of the human spirit. It is this juxtaposition, the soaring achievements of Greek thought, art, and politics, against the grim reality of slavery and hardship, that renders ancient Greece so strikingly instructive. The philosophers who debated virtue and justice, the dramatists who explored the tragic limits of human agency, the warriors who faced death with honor, and the slaves who endured unbearable toil, were part of the same world, interwoven. In ways both visible and hidden, greatness arose, not despite suffering, but, in many ways, because of it. The relentless struggle, the exposure to cruelty and mortality, the intimate acquaintance with vulnerability and limitation. These forged minds and spirits capable of extraordinary thought and heroism. Consider the festivals and rituals which offered the faintest respite from daily misery. The Dionysia, with its music, drama, and vibrant processions, allowed even the poorest citizens a moment of transcendence, a glimpse into a world shaped by gods and heroes, where courage, cunning, and virtue were celebrated. Even the slave, forced to serve in the shadows of the revelers, could bear witness to the beauty and meaning woven into human expression. These festivals, though fleeting and often excluding women and the enslaved from full participation, reinforced a shared cultural identity, a collective imagination that connected ordinary lives to the timeless mythic cycles of gods and heroes, of struggle, loss, and triumph. And in this interweaving of suffering and aspiration, we see the enduring lesson of ancient Greece. Civilization was never built on comfort or ease, but on the capacity to endure, to create and to strive in the face of adversity. The brilliant architecture, the epic poetry, the enduring philosophy, and the acts of courage that echo through history were inseparable from the hidden labor of the oppressed and the sacrifices of the many who would never be recorded in marble or verse. Without the unheralded toil of the enslaved, the brilliance of Greek civilization would have remained unrealized, a dream unattainable in the harsh sun of the Mediterranean world. Thus, as we contemplate the towering achievements of Athens and Sparta, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, the heroism of Leonidas, and the wisdom of Solon, let us remember the unseen figures whose suffering enabled these triumphs. The nameless slaves, the impoverished farmers, the soldiers who fell unseen on distant battlefields, and the children crushed by labor. Their endurance and fortitude are the hidden currents that shaped history. It is their courage in the face of cruelty, their perseverance under unrelenting hardship, and their quiet defiance of despair that form the true bedrock of the Hellenic legacy. And so, as we drift into contemplation, we honor not only the celebrated minds and heroic figures of Greece, but also those whose lives were defined by suffering and endurance. In their toil, oppression, and resilience, we find the paradox of human civilization, that even amidst relentless cruelty and adversity, the human spirit persists, aspires, and transforms pain into enduring beauty and wisdom. In the silent labor of the many lies the foundation of all that we revere, a reminder that civilization itself is built upon struggle, sacrifice, and the indomitable will to endure world, especially for those at the very bottom of its social hierarchy. The triumphs of Athens and Sparta, the brilliance of Plato and Aristotle, the heroism of Leonidas at Thermopylae, of these rested on the backs of the oppressed, whose lives were measured not in accolades or legacy, but in endless labor, fear, and deprivation. Even outside the mines, the daily existence of a slave was a relentless cycle of drudgery and anxiety. Farmers, children sold into servitude, rowers crammed into the dark holds of triremes, domestic servants constantly at the mercy of their master's temper. Each faced a reality where survival was itself a minor victory. Disease, malnutrition, and violence were constant companions, and familial bonds could be severed at a whim. Husbands and wives, parents and children were often torn apart in the merciless commerce of human property. Freedom was a distant, improbable dream, attainable only through extraordinary luck, cunning, or the rare generosity of a master. Yet even amidst this pervasive oppression, there were glimmers of human resilience. Some slaves learned to cultivate skills, knowledge, or relationships that allowed them to claim moments of dignity or even rise to positions of limited influence. Zeno of Citium was the exceptional case of mind forged by adversity, transformed into wisdom, and immortalized through philosophy. His story reminds us that even in the most oppressive circumstances, the human spirit can find avenues to assert itself, however rare and fleeting. For the vast majority, however, there was no escape from the cruel realities of ancient Greek life. Their toil fueled the glories of temples, theaters, and naval fleets, their suffering enabling the leisure and intellectual pursuits of the free. Every statue, every epic, every philosophical treatise that has survived the centuries was built upon lives of silent, unrecorded struggle. To understand Greece in its full dimension is to acknowledge this hidden foundation, to see that the glittering achievements of the city-states were inseparable from the pain, oppression, and endurance of those who labored unseen. Even in tragedy and heroism, the shadows of suffering were never far. While the great thinkers contemplated virtue and justice, and warriors achieved legendary feats, the enslaved, the poor, and the downtrodden remained bound by circumstance. Their reality was one of perpetual danger, ceaseless labor, and total dependence on forces beyond their control. Without their silent contributions, the intellectual, artistic, and military accomplishments we celebrate today could not have been realized. Thus, ancient Greece is a civilization of profound contradictions, unparalleled creativity, political experimentation, and cultural flourishing, built upon a society that was fundamentally unequal and often brutally cruel. The grandeur of the Parthenon, the poetry of Homer, the logic of Aristotle, these are inseparable from the suffering of the masses who made such achievements possible. To honor Greece is to acknowledge not only its triumphs, but the hidden costs, the invisible sacrifices, and the quiet endurance of the countless souls who labored, suffered, and died in its service. And so, in remembering the achievements of the Greeks, let us also remember the human cost that underpinned them, the slaves in the mines, the rowers in the triremes, the household servants, the impoverished farmers, the women whose labor sustained households and fields, all those whose lives were marked by hardship. It is their struggle that gave life to the brilliance of Greek civilization, their suffering that allowed freedom, philosophy, and art to flourish. Without them, the shining image of ancient Greece would be inconceivably civilization as remarkable for its endurance and resilience as for its genius. The story of ancient Greece is therefore not merely one of intellectual triumph or heroic deeds, but also a story of endurance, hardship, and the unbroken human spirit. It is a story that reminds us that civilization is never built by the few alone, but by the countless nameless many whose labor, suffering, and courage form the true foundation of history's achievements. The world, if you were not lucky enough to be born into the ranks of the privileged few, life in ancient Greece could be merciless. It was a society that did not hesitate to exploit the weak and turn a blind eye to their suffering. And this harsh legacy endured for centuries to come, stretching through the Roman period and beyond. Systems of slavery, serfdom, and forced labor remained entrenched throughout much of the classical world. It would take until modern times for the ideals of universal human rights and freedoms to slowly, painfully take root. So, as we marvel at humanity's first faltering steps toward democracy, philosophy, and high culture in ancient Greece, we must also grapple with this darker side of the classical legacy. The Greeks laid the foundations for so much of what we value in Western civilization today, but they also bequeathed to us troubling traditions of social inequality, domination, and subjugation challenges we are still struggling to overcome in the end. The true story of ancient Greece was not the shining white marble of the Parthenon, or the noble words of Socrates and Plato. It was the cries of the desperate and downtrodden, the fears of the powerless, the injustices endured by the many so that a few might prosper. It was a bittersweet symphony of the highs and lows of the human condition. We celebrate the ancient Greeks for their triumphs, but we must also mourn what they suffered, and in that suffering, we can perhaps see the crucible in which the ideals we still cherish today were painfully forged. the notions of compassion, equality, and human dignity, which have taken so many centuries to flower, have their roots in a world often marked by oppression. Ancient Greece, immortal and inimitable, was a land of towering genius and achievements, but it was also built upon the bowed and broken backs of the anonymous oppressed. As we close our eyes and drift into sleep, let us imagine a world where the marvels of human invention could flourish without such a cost in human misery. A world the Greeks gave us the first glimpse of, even if they themselves could not fully reach it. The grim fate that awaited many Greek slaves was perhaps most shockingly embodied by the thousands who toiled ceaselessly in the infamous silver mines of Laurium, located in a barren region southeast of Athens. These tunnels and shafts delved deep into the earth, following veins of silver-bearing lead, or this precious metal was vital to Athens' burgeoning economy and imperial ambitions, but it came at a horrific human cost. The mines were worked entirely by slaves, many of them prisoners of war, debtors, or simply those unlucky enough to be born into bondage. They labored in appalling conditions, hacking away at rock in sweltering, cramped tunnels by the light of flickering oil lamps. The air was foul with dust and fumes. Many suffered grievous injuries from falls, collapsing tunnels, or the chronic effects of breathing the toxic air. Life expectancy in the mines of Laurium was pitifully short. Few survived more than a year or two of this nightmarish existence before succumbing to disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Yet the flow of silver and fresh bodies to replace the fallen never ceased. Unimaginable wealth for the Athenian state was purchased by unimaginable suffering. The quota each slave was required to produce was relentless, and any failure could bring beatings or worse. Children, barely able to carry their own weight, labored alongside men and women, their tiny hands scraping or from the walls. Families were torn apart, husbands from wives, parents from children. The cries of the enslaved echoed through the tunnels, a haunting testament to the human cost of Athens' greatness. Not all slaves in ancient Greece met quite such a grim fate, but their lives were still filled with constant work, poverty, and fear. In Athens alone, enslaved people made up at least a third of the total population. Many were foreigners, seized as war captives or bought from slave traders. Others fell into slavery through debt or were simply born into servitude. Slaves worked in every sector of the economy: farmers, miners, factory workers, rowers in the fleet, or domestic servants. Household slaves who attended to wealthier Greek families might have had marginally better conditions, yet their existence remained precarious. They could be punished, sold off, or abused on a whim by their masters. There was no escape from this life of servitude. Runaway slaves, if caught, faced brutal floggings, branding, or even execution. Their best hope was that they might perhaps be granted freedom by a kindly master after decades of loyal service in old age. But for most, slavery was a life sentence of grinding work and bondage, stretching from dawn to dusk, year after year, until death finally released them. Yet even in this harsh world, there were exceptions, rare souls who rose above their station. Zeno of Citium, born in the 4th century BCE, began life as a slave, stripped of everything in a foreign land. Yet his intellect, curiosity, and relentless pursuit of knowledge caught the attention of a kind master who set him on the path to study philosophy. Zeno would go on to found the Stoic school, teaching that all humans share a divine spark and that virtue, reason, and inner fortitude could transcend even the worst of circumstances. His story, while rare, offered a glimmer of hope amid the darkness. Despite its soaring cultural and intellectual achievements, ancient Greece remained a cruel and unforgiving world for the majority of its inhabitants. For every brilliant philosopher or celebrated warrior, countless nameless slaves, peasants, and laborers struggled to survive. Their toil under the broiling Mediterranean sun, their vulnerability to disease, famine, and violence, and their oppression at the hands of the powerful formed the hidden foundation upon which Greek civilization rose. And so, when we marvel at the majestic Parthenon, the profound works of Homer, or the timeless dramas of Sophocles, we must also remember the hidden suffering that made these achievements possible. The history of ancient Greece is not just a story of triumph and brilliance, it is also a story of struggle, sacrifice, and the resilience of the human spirit. As we drift into the quiet of sleep, let us remember the slaves in the Laurium mines, the farmers in the fields, the rowers in the Athenian navy, and the countless others whose lives were spent in relentless toil. For it was their labor, their endurance, and their suffering that paradoxically allowed the brilliance of Greek culture to shine through. And in that knowledge, we can find a quiet, contemplative respect for the human story, both its darkness and its light. Sleep now, gently, and let the echoes of ancient Greece lull you into dreams of marble columns, flickering oil lamps, and the timeless struggle of humanity striving, always striving, toward light. High above the shafts, beatings and mutilations were commonplace for any who faltered in their ceaseless toil. There was no rest, no respite, and no mercy. When one slave collapsed, they would simply be dragged away to die out of sight, while another unfortunate soul was thrust into their place. It is impossible for us now to truly conceive of the horror and hopelessness that these poor, benighted souls endured to be cast into the dank, hellish tunnels of Laurium. Was to enter a world cut off from light in every sense, devoid of comfort, kindness, or dignity, where death was the only release. Yet their plight was simply accepted as an unremarkable fact of life. The great cradle of democracy depended foundationally on their mute suffering. Occasionally, however, a fluke of fate could transform a slave's destiny in the most dramatic way imaginable. One of the most famous examples is the remarkable story of Zeno of Citium. Born around 334 BCE in the Greek city-state of Citium on Cyprus, Zeno began his life as a slave. Details of his early years are scarce, but at some point he found himself shipwrecked near Athens. Wandering into a bookshop, he became engrossed in the works of Zenon, a student of Socrates. Zeno had discovered his calling. Impressed by his keen mind and determination, his master granted him freedom to pursue his studies. Against all odds, Zeno flourished in his adopted city. He studied under the eminent Cynic philosopher Crates of Thebes, but soon founded his own school of thought, which became known as Stoicism. The Stoic teachings of virtue, asceticism, and inner tranquility resonated powerfully in a world fraught with upheaval and adversity. Zeno's works were studied and admired by luminaries from Scipio Africanus to Cicero and Seneca. Stoicism became one of the most influential philosophies in the Greco-Roman world, and Zeno himself was revered as one of the great sages of Athens. His trajectory from anonymous slave to towering figure of classical philosophy was extraordinary. While Zeno's story may seem like one in a million, it underscored an important truth. The boundaries between slave and free in ancient Greece were not always impermeable. Slaves were not a separate species, but human beings with potential. Under certain circumstances, even a slave could transcend their degraded status and achieve greatness. The Athenian general and statesman Timotheus, for example, was said to be the son of a Thracian slave woman. The poet Philoxenus of Cythera and the fabulist Aesop were also believed to have begun life as slaves. Yet, for the vast majority, there would be no such redemption. Their dismal lot was simply to endure, to eke out a meager, constricted, and often painfully abbreviated existence in the shadow of the free. The institution of slavery was one of the pillars that held up the grand edifice of classical Greek civilization, but that gleaming mantle concealed an ocean of misery, lives ground down by relentless exploitation, scarred by systematic brutality, and stripped of dignity. It is an unavoidable paradox at the heart of ancient Greece's complex legacy. As the Greek world lurched into the 4th century BCE, warfare unleashed new waves of devastation and social upheaval. Mighty Athens and Sparta, after decades of ruinous conflict during the Peloponnesian War, were greatly diminished. A power vacuum loomed. Into this breach strode the dynamic young kingdom of Macedon, led by its most illustrious ruler, Alexander. The Great Alexander's brief but meteoric career would spark a new age of Greek civilization, the Hellenistic period. But before this sprawling cultural flowering could flourish, Alexander's vaulting ambition first ushered in a scale of bloodshed unlike anything the Greek world had yet seen. Born in 356 BCE to King Philip II of Macedon, Alexander was groomed for supremacy from an early age. He counted the great philosopher Aristotle among his tutors, absorbing lessons not only in philosophy and science, but also in governance and ethics. Yet Alexander's true genius lay in the art of war. When Philip was murdered in 336 BCE, Alexander ascended the throne at the tender age of 20. Immediately, he set his sights on the East and on etching his name in history. With an elite army of battle-hardened Macedonian troops, he embarked on a campaign of conquest that would ultimately cover more than 20,000 miles, forge an empire stretching from Greece to India, and enshrine his name as a byword for ambition, brilliance, and the immense cost of human endeavor. Martial glory followed Alexander to this day. His army, with its crack-heavy cavalry and nearly invincible sarissa-wielding pikemen, proved a formidable machine of conquest. He led them first into Persia, toppling the mighty Achaemenid Empire, then to Egypt, where he was hailed as a divine pharaoh, and finally as far as the banks of the Indus River in 326 BCE. Everywhere he marched, Alexander left a trail of subjugated cities and shattered armies in his wake. Fabled bastions like Tyre and Gaza were reduced to rubble, and their surviving populations were sold en masse into slavery at the climactic Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Alexander was said to have slain over 50,000 Persians in a single day, turning the battlefield into a charnel house of hacked and trampled flesh. While his military genius was undeniable, the human cost was staggering. His blazing ambition brought purges and paranoia even within his own ranks. When his beloved companion Hephaestion died in 324 BCE, Alexander, unhinged by grief, reportedly massacred an entire tribe in the Hindu Kush as part of a funeral sacrifice. By the time Alexander himself died at the age of just 32. From an alcohol-fueled fever, he had carved out one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Yet the breathtaking scale and speed of his achievements were matched by a toll of blood and suffering. Hundreds of thousands had perished, and whole societies were left reeling in the wake of his conquests. His abrupt death sent shockwaves through his fragile empire, sparking power struggles between generals that splintered the realm into warring dynasties. The Hellenistic world that emerged would be a crucible of cultural fusion and intellectual ferment, but also an arena of chronic conflict and political upheaval. Life, for the common Greek, remained as turbulent and precarious as ever. Looming over all of this strife was the ever-present shadow of death. For all its glittering achievements, ancient Greek society could do shockingly little to fend off the mortal realities of accident, injury, or illness. With no understanding of germ theory or antisepsis, even the most mundane wound or malady could prove fatal. Childhood was particularly perilous. Perhaps half of all Greek children did not survive to adulthood. Infectious diseases, from dysentery to typhoid fever, swept through the population in periodic epidemics. Chronic ailments like tuberculosis and malaria sapped the strength and livelihoods of countless families. The practice of medicine, though increasingly systematized and observational, still relied heavily on erroneous theories of the body and primitive surgical techniques. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, purging, and often toxic medicaments as much as they offered remedies. Patients with grave conditions could only hope for the favor of the gods. For those fortunate enough to survive into old age, senescence itself could be a drawn-out torment in a world lacking even the simplest palliative care. The elderly often faced increasing isolation, infirmity, and privation if they lacked family to support them. Even the celebrated Athenian statesman was not spared. He is said to have wasted away after contracting the plague that ravaged Athens in 430 BCE, his brilliant mind unraveling under the strain of illness. Death, when it came, was raw and visceral. There were no hospitals, no hospices, no analgesics, no life support to ease the inevitable. The moribund would breathe their last on a simple pallet at home or on the open battlefield, at best surrounded by loved ones. Funeral rites were an essential duty. Families washed and anointed the body, conducted lamentations, and oversaw burial or cremation. Yet even these sacred rituals could not soften the brute reality of death in a pre-modern world. As one more soul slipped into the shadows of Hades, this then is the sobering mosaic of daily existence, lurking behind the towering intellectual, artistic, and political triumphs of ancient Greece. It is a portrait of life at its most elemental, stripped of the comforts and safeguards we take for granted. From the Athenian farmer laboring to wrest sustenance from stingy soil, to the Spartan helot crushed under the boot of a pitiless warrior elite, from the plague-ridden streets of Periclean Athens to the howling death pits of the Peloponnesian War. The common Greek was locked in an unrelenting struggle for survival against both human and elemental foes. It was a world harsh and abrasive, yet vibrant and inspiring, a crucible that demanded every ounce of fortitude, ingenuity, and endurance the human spirit could muster. That Greek civilization accomplished so much while navigating such unremitting adversity must stand eternally to their credit, but it is also a poignant reminder of the nameless, faceless multitude whose toil, suffering, and sacrifice underpinned every gleaming temple, every philosophical treatise, every triumph of art and war. Numerous ranks of ordinary Greeks who shouldered the weight of those achievements without tasting their fruits. Those who endured, as the poet Hesiod wrote, toiling ceaselessly like the bees in the spring when they feed and rear the grubs, working themselves to death, poor things, because they keep at it all day long from sunrise to sunset. In grappling with the ancient Greek experience, we must always step back from the glistening pinnacles of art and argument to survey that human topography in full. We must remember the scars and calluses, the fears and hungers, the lives worn raw by deprivation and diktat. Only then can we appreciate the true temper of a civilization, the cost as well as the glory. Our world today would scarcely be recognizable to Pericles or Plato. The material conditions, the scope of knowledge, the assumptions of society have all changed beyond measure. And yet, peering through the mists of centuries, we can still feel the tug of a shared human condition. The Greeks to knew love and loss, suffering and transcendence, the aching beauty and brevity of life. They too struggled to impose meaning on the vagaries of fate and to light the spark of something enduring amidst the enveloping shade as we sift the drifted strata of their distant lives. Perhaps the most important lesson we can glean is one of perspective, to fully appreciate our own time, our own lives, in all their precious imperfection, to recognize all that we take for granted and all that connects us to those who came before. The ancient Greeks crafted a legacy that echoes down the ages in philosophy, in statecraft, in art and architecture, in the very sense of Western identity. But they equally remind us of the eternal fragility of the human enterprise, the finely blown boundaries of order and of life itself. In contemplating their world, so alien and yet so oddly proximate, we come face to face with the bigger questions of what it means to live, to strive, to leave some lasting mark on an indifferent cosmos, and in the end, perhaps, to make our own weary peace with a universe we cannot control but only ride upon, like sailors on a storm-tossed sea. For one brief and shining moment, the ancient Greek world was also one of near-constant warfare and conflict. Battle was a way of life for the Greek city-states, with gruesome methods like the phalanx, formation and siege warfare commonplace. In the phalanx, rows of heavily armed hoplite soldiers would lock their shields together, forming a nearly impenetrable wall of wood, bronze, and flesh. They would advance on the enemy line, thrusting their spears forward in unison, aiming to break through with brute force. It was a horrifying sight and sound. Thousands of men yelling their war cries, the clash of shields and armor, the screams of the dying. Siege warfare was equally brutal. When one city-state sought to conquer another, they would surround the city walls and cut off all supplies, seeking to starve the population into submission. This could drag on for months, even years. The people inside the city walls would slowly waste away, succumbing to disease and malnutrition, with the stench of death and decay permeating the air. Outside, the besieging army would pelt the city with boulders, arrows, and even catapulted balls of flaming pitch to spread fires inside. Sometimes they would attempt to undermine the walls by digging tunnels beneath them. If the city fell, the invading army would pour through the breached walls, running, riot-burning, looting, and enslaving the survivors. It was a grim fate, inescapable even for the mightiest city-states like Athens and Sparta. During the 27-year-long Peloponnesian War, tens of thousands were killed on both sides. One particularly disastrous episode centered around the brash Athenian noble Alcibiades, a ward of the famous Pericles. Alcibiades convinced the Athenians to launch an all-out expedition against the powerful city of Syracuse in Sicily. He claimed that once Syracuse fell, all of Sicily would come under Athenian control, providing a base to eventually conquer Carthage and dominate the western Mediterranean. It was an audacious plan, but it would prove calamitous. The Athenians assembled a massive force of some 30,000 men and over 100 warships, stripping the city of vital manpower, funds, and resources. The campaign soon descended into disaster. Disease, famine, and relentless resistance decimated their forces. Ships were lost, soldiers killed, and many were captured and sold into slavery. A cruel echo of the countless unknown souls who had labored so long in the mines, fields, and workshops of Greece. Sabiades was to be one of 3 commanders leading the Athenian armada. But on the eve of departure, a shocking controversy erupted. Sacred statues of Hermes throughout Athens were found mutilated overnight, and rumors swirled that Sabiades was responsible, having committed the sacrilege during a drunken escapade. Facing outrage and legal charges, Sabiades fled to Athens' mortal enemy, Sparta, before the fleet even set sail. Deprived of their most charismatic leader, the Athenian force carried on to Sicily under Nicias, a capable but cautious and pessimistic general. After initial successes, the Athenians became bogged down in a protracted siege of Syracuse. Sparta, at Sabiades' urging, sent reinforcements and a ruthless commander named Gylippus to aid the Syracusans. The Athenians, riddled by disease and hunger, were eventually surrounded and decisively defeated. Their fleet was destroyed, and their army almost entirely killed or captured. Athens ended up losing as much as 2/3 of its adult male population, a near-fatal blow from which the city never fully recovered. The Sicilian disaster highlighted the staggering human cost of Greek warfare. Thousands would die far from home, often from sickness as much as from battle itself. Many thousands more would be sold into slavery if captured. Even the survivors often returned with crippling wounds and psychological trauma. At the same time, the economic toll was immense. Waging war consumed vast sums of money and resources, while trade, agriculture, and public works languished. This deepened the poverty and hardship of daily life for the masses. War was not just the scourge of free Greek citizens. It was also the grim conduit through which many foreigners and the unlucky were forced into perhaps the cruelest fate of all in the Greek world, a life of brutal slavery. Slavery was appallingly widespread in ancient Greece, forming the dark underbelly of Greek society and economy. By some estimates, there were 7 slaves for each free citizen in Athens, meaning that a significant portion of the population lived in bondage. The abhorrent conditions and exploitation these souls endured are difficult for the modern mind to fathom. Slaves were viewed as living property with no rights or legal protections whatsoever. Many were captives from foreign wars, ripped from their homelands and families, and transported in chains to major slave markets in Athens, Chios, and Delos. There they were put on display, poked and prodded by prospective buyers, and auctioned to the highest bidder. Prices ranged from 50 to 200 drachmae for common laborers or domestic servants, to over 1,000 drachmae for highly skilled craftsmen. Once purchased, the suffering truly began. Slaves toiled from dawn to dusk under the whip and the watchful eye of slave drivers. Thousands labored on the wealthy estates of the aristocracy, tending olive groves and vineyards. Many more worked as household servants, cooks, cleaners, and wet nurses. They could be subjected to beatings, brandings, sexual exploitation, and even summary execution at the whim of their masters. It was a precarious and often short existence. Perhaps the grimmest fate awaited those who labored deep underground in the silver mines of Laurium. Within these Stygian labyrinths, thousands of wretched souls clawed precious silver, ore from the earth, powering Athens' wealth and prestige. Men, women, and children as young as 5 would descend into the stifling shafts for days at a time, chipping at the rock by flickering lantern light. Accidents, rock falls, and noxious gases claimed countless lives. Most slowly wasted away from malnutrition, chronic illness, and grueling toil. Many committed suicide rather than face such prolonged agony. Laurium was, in every sense, a vision of hell made real. One remarkable man who endured this subterranean nightmare was Zeno of Citium, the future founder of the Stoic school of philosophy. Zeno began his improbable life as a Phoenician merchant, but his ship sank in a storm off the coast of Greece, and he washed up on shore with nothing. There he was captured, transported to Athens, and sold as a slave to work in the Laurium mines. Despite the soul-crushing hardship, Zeno's keen intellect and indomitable will would carry him far beyond the darkness of his early years. Zeno retained his resilient and inquisitive spirit. After grueling days in the mines, he would linger in the streets of Athens, listening to the great philosophers debate and teach. He saved what meager pennies he could until he finally bought his freedom. Destitute but unbroken, Zeno devoted himself to philosophy. He often taught at the Agora and the Stoa, where he attracted a devoted following with his teachings on accepting fate, mastering one's emotions, and cultivating self-reliance. His Stoic school would become one of the most influential in all of Greece and Rome, shaping minds like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Zeno's remarkable story underscores that while ancient Greece was undoubtedly a cruel and unforgiving world for the vast majority, extraordinary individuals could still rise above their brutal circumstances. But his trajectory from foreign merchant to wretched slave to transformational philosopher was exceedingly rare. The reality is that the weak, the poor, and the unlucky masses faced subjugation, enslavement, or early death. Daily life was a harsh struggle for survival, and freedom was a precious commodity enjoyed only by a privileged minority. This was the bleak reality behind the glorious facade of Greek art and architecture, behind the soaring works of Homer and the great Athenian, tragedies that still resound through the ages. It was a world of extremes, of oligarchs and slaves, of brilliant thinkers and wretched laborers, of magnificent cities built on the scarred backs of the many a world of short, often violent lives, of plague and famine, of subjugation and constant warfare. The fact that the ancient Greeks achieved so much in art, philosophy, literature, and science in the face of such unrelenting adversity makes their accomplishments all the more remarkable. And so, as we drift off to sleep, lulled by these ancient tales, perhaps we can reflect that we are the fortunate ones, descendants of the modern age. For all our struggles and cares, we can give thanks that our daily lot is not one of antiquity, toiling beneath the Athenian sun, forever at the mercy of fickle gods and cruel men. The brutal world of ancient Greece lives on in our collective memory, revealed by the enduring works and deeds that still speak to us across the vast gulf of time. Those long-stilled voices and long-vanished lives grant us perspective, helping us navigate the challenges of our present day more wisely. And with that bittersweet thought, good night. The grim fate of Greek slaves was unavoidable. Slavery was an inescapable reality in ancient Greek society, a ubiquitous practice that fueled the economy and supported the elite way of life. From Athens to Sparta, slaves toiled in households, on farms, and in workshops, their labor exploited for the benefit of their masters. It's estimated that in some city-states, slaves made up as much as 1/3 of the total population. These enslaved individuals faced wretched living conditions, grueling labor, and the constant threat of violence and abuse. Many were captives of war, ripped from their homes and families as spoils of Greek military conquests. Others fell into slavery through piracy, kidnapping, or by being born to slave parents. Once enslaved, they became the property of their masters, to be bought, sold, and treated as mere commodities. Slaves had no legal rights or protections, and their lives were entirely at the mercy of their owners. The experience of slaves varied somewhat, depending on their role and the temperament of their masters. Domestic slaves in wealthy households might have a marginally better quality of life, serving as cooks, cleaners, childcare providers, or even tutors for the family's children. Yet, even these fortunate few lived under constant oversight, their freedoms tightly constrained, their existence defined by servitude, children. But even these privileged domestic slaves were subject to the whims and abuses of their masters. Female slaves in particular often faced sexual exploitation and assault. For the majority of slaves, daily life was filled with backbreaking labor and squalid conditions. Countless slaves worked from sunrise to sunset in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, tending to livestock, and performing any number of arduous agricultural tasks. With poor diets consisting of meager rations, inadequate clothing and shelter, and virtually no access to medical care, many rural slaves succumbed to malnourishment, exposure, and disease, one of the most notoriously brutal fates for a slave in ancient Greece was being sent to the silver mines, such as the infamous mines of Laurium, located near Athens. Deep underground, thousands of slaves toiled in hellish conditions, chiseling out the precious ore that helped finance the Athenian empire. With air thick with dust, narrow tunnels prone to collapse, and only dim oil lamps to light the way, the mines were a living nightmare. Slaves worked in chains, facing regular beatings from their overseers to keep up the grueling pace. Many would not survive more than a few years in the mines before perishing from injuries, respiratory illnesses, or sheer exhaustion. The story of one ill-fated slave stands out as a chilling example. In 413 BCE, a young man named Dorius was captured after the Athenian siege of Syracuse and sold into slavery. A strong, able-bodied man, Dorius was immediately sent to the Laurium mines by his new master. Day after day, he chipped away at the rock face, his hands blistering and bleeding, his lungs filling with toxic dust. The meager scraps of food were never enough to sustain him through the long, unforgiving hours in the dark tunnels. Dorius's only solace was the bond he formed with his fellow slavesmen who struggled alongside him in shared misery. Together, they would whisper prayers and tell stories of their former lives, trying to hold on to some shred of hope and humanity. But as the months dragged on, Dorius watched his compatriots collapse one by one, their bodies giving out under the relentless toll of the mines. After 2 years of brutal servitude, Dorius finally succumbed, weakened by malnourishment and racked with an unrelenting cough. He collapsed in a heap and breathed his last in the cold, damp darkness of the mineshaft. His body was unceremoniously hauled away to be dumped in an unmarked grave, just one more disposable cog in the machine of Greek industry and power. Dorius's experience, while especially horrific, was not uncommon. Slaves in ancient Greece faced a grim and often short existence, with few prospects beyond a life of hardship and an ignominious death. Even those who survived to old age could not expect a gentle twilight. Elderly or infirm slaves who could no longer work were often simply abandoned to die of exposure or starvation. Yet despite the unimaginable suffering they endured, the enslaved people of ancient Greece were not simply passive victims. There are scattered accounts of slave rebellions and uprisings, desperate attempts to resist oppression and win freedom against all odds. In most cases, these rebellions were ruthlessly put down, with participants executed as a warning to others. But they stand as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to accept the grim fate handed to them. Perhaps the most famous example of a slave who rose above his station was the philosopher Zeno of Citium. Born in the late 4th century BCE in the city of Citium on Cyprus, Zeno was the son of a merchant family, but fate would soon cast him into hardship, propelling him on a journey that would transform him from a destitute slave into one of the most influential philosophers of the ancient world. Around the age of 30, Zeno's life took a dramatic turn. While on a trading voyage, he was shipwrecked and lost everything. Washing up on the shores of Athens, Zeno was soon enslaved, purchased by a wealthy Athenian to serve as a lowly household attendant. Yet even in bondage, his inquiring mind and keen intellect did not go unnoticed. According to legend, his master was so impressed by Zeno's wit and wisdom that he eventually freed him, allowing Zeno to pursue philosophy full-time, embracing the austere teachings of the Cynics. Zeno went on to found the Stoic school of thought. He preached a message of virtuous living, self-discipline, and inner fortitude, in the face of hardship. In a profound twist of fate, a man who began his life as a slave left an enduring philosophical legacy that has inspired minds for over 2 millennia. His journey from destitution to intellectual immortality stands as a rare beacon of hope in an otherwise harsh world. Yet, for every exceptional story like Zeno's, countless more slaves lived and died anonymously under the yoke of Greek brutality. Their suffering and subjugation, though often overlooked, were a dark and inextricable undercurrent to the glories and achievements of ancient Greek civilization. The wealth of Athens, the splendor of its temples, and the brilliance of its thinkers were built upon the silent toil and sacrifice of the powerless. It is a somber reminder that even the most advanced societies can be built on foundations of terrible injustice and cruelty. As we come to the end of our journey through the harsh realities of life in ancient Greece, it is worth reflecting on the lessons this distant yet strangely familiar world offers. The Greeks, for all their lofty ideals and intellectual triumphs, were still very much a product of their time, shaped by the brutality, inequality, and capriciousness that have marked human history across the ages. Yet it would be a mistake to dismiss their struggles and successes as merely relics of a benighted past in many ways. The challenges they faced, the specter of war, the ravages of disease, the oppression of the weak by the strong are challenges that still confront us today. How we choose to meet them, both as individuals and as societies, will determine the kind of world we shape for ourselves and for generations to come. Perhaps the true value of studying history is not simply to catalog events of the past, but to gain a deeper understanding of the human condition in all its frailty, cruelty, and indomitable resilience. By grappling with the grim realities our ancestors endured, we may find the wisdom and resolve to bend the arc of our own story toward a brighter, more compassionate future, one in which the dignity and worth of every person are celebrated, and the horrors of slavery and oppression are consigned to the dustbin of history. It is a noble aspiration, one that requires vigilance and courage, even against the longest odds. For, as the Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote, "As is a tale, so is life. Not how long it is, but how good it is what matters." May we all live our tales with courage, conviction, and unwavering commitment to building a world of justice and decency for all. And so, as we drift off to slumber, let us hold in our hearts the memory of all those who came before us, the farmers and soldiers, the artisans and philosophers, the masters and the enslaved. Their struggles and their triumphs, their joys and their sorrows, echo through the ages to remind us of our shared humanity and our shared responsibility to one another. In the quiet of the night, as the ancient world fades into the mists of dream, may we find the strength to face our own challenges with grace and resolve, and may the hard-won wisdom of the past light our way towards a future of greater compassion, justice, and peace for all. Good night. The grim fate of slaves in ancient Greece is a stark reminder of the cruelty and inhumanity that pervaded this celebrated society. For every gleaming marble temple or renowned philosopher, there were thousands of wretched souls toiling in bondage, their suffering and sacrifices lost to history. The Greeks saw slavery as a natural and necessary part of the social order. Aristotle himself declared that some men were slaves by nature destined to serve their superiors. This belief allowed even the most enlightened thinkers to justify the ownership and exploitation of their fellow human beings. And exploited they were, for slaves were nothing more than living tools to the Greeks' disposable property, to be used as their masters saw fit. Slaves worked from sunup to sundown, performing back-breaking labor in the fields' mines. Workshops and homes with no reprieve, they were frequently beaten, starved, and subjected to all manner of abuse and indignity. Many slaves met a particularly grisly end in the silver mines of Laurium near Athens. Their thousands of unfortunate captives were sent to live out their days in dark, suffocating tunnels, hacking away at the rock in search of precious, or the air was thick with poisonous dust, and cave-ins were a constant danger. Slaves who survived these hellish conditions rarely lasted more than a few years before perishing from injury, disease, or sheer exhaustion. A similarly bleak fate awaited the crews who rowed and fought aboard the warships of Athens. In order to maintain its vast naval supremacy, the city relied on a great number of slave oarsmen to propel its mighty triumphs. Into battle, these men were chained to their benches and whipped mercilessly by overseers to keep time, even as missiles rained down from enemy ships in the heat of combat. Many would drown, shackled to their oars, dragged to a watery grave by the very vessels they powered, despite the unimaginable hardship of their lives. Some slaves managed to rise above their circumstances through luck or sheer force of will. One such remarkable figure was Zeno of Citium, the founder of the Stoic school of philosophy. Born in the Phoenician city of Citium around 334 BC, Zeno found himself on a ship to Athens as a young merchant, but fortune took a tragic turn when he was shipwrecked and sold into slavery as the property of a wealthy Athenian. Zeno labored for years before finally gaining his freedom. Undaunted by adversity, Zeno went on to study under the great philosopher Crates of Thebes. In time, he began teaching his own brand of philosophy, which emphasized virtue, reason, and inner strength as the keys to living well. At the heart of Stoicism was the idea that external circumstances, no matter how grim, need not determine one's peace of mind and moral character. It is a profound irony that Zeno, once a lowly slave, would create a school of thought so influential that it shaped great minds, from Emperor Marcus Aurelius to Nelson Mandela. His personal triumph over bondage and suffering serves as a poignant counterpoint to the innumerable unnamed slaves whose tragic fates were the rule, not the exception, in ancient Greece. As we delve further into this brutal chapter of history, it is impossible not to be moved by the scale of human anguish that built the foundations of Western civilization. The great monuments and institutions we marvel at today were erected on the scarred backs of people deemed less than human by their own society. It is a devastating legacy we are still grappling with centuries later. Yet even in the darkest corners of the Greek world, the resilient human spirit endured. Slaves like Zeno remind us that no amount of cruelty and oppression can extinguish our capacity for hope, wisdom, and dignity in the face of unimaginable odds. Theirs are the untold stories that whisper from the shadows of history, bearing witness to the unbreakable will to survive and overcome. As we contemplate these somber truths, it is easy to feel the weight of all that was lost and destroyed on the long road to the present. But we must also recognize how far we've come, and how much further still we have to go in building a world of justice and compassion for all the voices of the enslaved and downtrodden of ancient Greece call out to us across the ages, urging us to honor their struggles by shaping a future where no human being is ever again treated as lesser than any other. It is a daunting task, but one we must undertake with the same courage and determination displayed by those who endured the unendurable. Long ago, in this way, we can begin to forge a new legacy, one that celebrates not only the loftiest achievements of the past, but also the quiet heroism of the humble souls who persisted and perished in the shadows of history. Only then can we truly do justice to the memory of all those for whom life in ancient Greece was a brutal and unforgiving trial. The subjugation of women is another dark chapter in the annals of Greek civilization that belies its veneer of enlightenment and progress. For all the soaring rhetoric about democracy, reason, and human excellence, the Greeks saw fit to keep half of their population in a state of subordination and servitude based solely on their sex. From birth to death, women in ancient Greece navigated a treacherous landscape of restrictions, obligations, and vulnerabilities. Their lives were circumscribed by the whims of men, fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons, who held absolute power over their fates. Athenian society, in particular, was notorious for its strict control over women's bodies, and movements. Respectable women were expected to stay cloistered within the home, tending to children and domestic tasks, rarely venturing outside except for special occasions. Like religious festivals, this seclusion was enforced through architecture itself, with houses designed around a central courtyard that served as the women's domain. High walls and sturdy doors separated this inner sanctum from the public sphere, creating a physical barrier between the sexes. On the rare occasions when women did leave the house, they were still bound by a suffocating web of social conventions. They could not go out alone or converse with unrelated men. When in public, they were required to veil themselves and cast their eyes downward to avoid attracting attention or provoking male lust. Even within the supposed safety of the home, women enjoyed precious little autonomy or agency. Marriages were arranged by fathers and guardians with no input from the bride herself. Once wed, a woman came under the complete control of her husband, who had the power to divorce her on a whim or even lend her to other men for procreation. Perhaps the cruelest twist of fate for Greek women was that their primary value lay in their ability to produce male heirs. For their husbands' households, failure to bear healthy sons was grounds for divorce or worse. This merciless calculus placed enormous pressure on women to fulfill their reproductive duties, even at great personal risk. Childbirth in the ancient world was a harrowing ordeal, with no anesthesia, antiseptics, or understanding of basic hygiene. Complications like hemorrhage and infection claimed countless mothers' lives. Those who survived the dangers of delivery faced the daunting task of raising children in a world stacked against them. With virtually no access to education or enrichment, women were consigned to an endless cycle of pregnancy, nursing, and domestic labor. Generations lived and died without ever glimpsing a world beyond the narrow confines of hearth and home. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming oppression, some remarkable women managed to carve out a measure of influence and independence. The legendary philosopher and mathematician Hypatia of Alexandria is one such shining example. Born around 350 AD, Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a noted scholar who bucked societal norms by providing her with a rigorous education. Under his tutelage, she blossomed into a brilliant thinker, mastering complex subjects like astronomy, mechanics, and Neoplatonist philosophy as an adult. Hypatia became a renowned teacher in her own right, attracting students from far and wide to her lectures. On mathematics and science, she was also a prolific author, penning commentaries on works by Euclid and Ptolemy that influenced scholars for centuries to come. But Hypatia's greatest achievement may have been the way she lived as a fiercely independent, unmarried woman in a man's world. She moved freely through public spaces, engaging in spirited debates with male intellectuals and earning the admiration of powerful figures like the prefect Orestes in a time when women were seen as little more than breeding stock. Hypatia dared to cultivate her mind and speak her truth. She embodied the highest ideals of Greek philosophy, the pursuit of knowledge, reason, and virtue for their own sake. Tragically, Hypatia's luminous life was cut short by the very forces of ignorance and intolerance she sought to overcome. In 415 she was brutally murdered by a mob of Christian zealots who saw her as a threat to their worldview, dragged from her chariot and stripped naked. Hypatia was flayed alive with sharp tiles and oyster shells. Her mutilated body was then burned to ashes, as if to erase all trace of her existence. It is a bitter irony that one of the brightest lights of the ancient world was extinguished by the same violent misogyny she transcended in life. Hypatia's story stands as a searing indictment of the cruelty and waste inherent in any system that denies half of humanity the right to reach its full potential. As we reflect on the enormity of what women in ancient Greece endured and achieved in the face of impossible odds, we cannot help but feel a sense of kinship and responsibility to their struggles. The brave few, like Hypatia, who dared to defy their society's suffocating constraints, light the path forward for all those still fighting for basic dignity and agency. Today, their courage calls us to imagine a world where no one's dreams are circumscribed by their gender, where everyone has the freedom to learn, create, and self-actualize to the fullest extent of their abilities. This is the vision we must strive for, even as we grapple with the sobering lessons of the past, for the shadows of ancient Greece's misogyny still lengthen over the present. In ways both overt and subtle, women around the globe continue to face violence, discrimination, and diminished opportunities solely on account of their sex. The struggle for true equality and liberation is far from over. But in the indomitable spirits of women like Hypatia, we can find the resilience and resolve to keep pushing forward, to keep chipping away at the cages that hem us in until they crumble away entirely, in telling their stories, in reckoning with the full scope of their oppression and resistance. We begin the vital work of weaving women back into the tapestry of history, from which they've so often been erased. We honor their sacrifices and draw strength from their example as we fight to forge a future worthy of their hopes and dreams. It is a daunting challenge, but one we must meet with the same fierce determination as the unsung heroines who came before us. Only then can we hope to build a world where every life is valued, every voice heard, and every soul free to write its own destiny. In the fullness of time, as we turn our gaze to the savagery of Greek warfare, we confront yet another aspect of ancient civilization, drenched in blood and sorrow. For all their lofty ideals and artistic splendor, the Greeks were a society forged and fractured by near-constant conflict. Battle was a way of life, a grim necessity in the struggle for power and survival between rival city-states. At the heart of this brutal calculus was the hoplite, the heavily armored infantrymen who formed the backbone of Greek armies, clad in bronze helmets, breastplates, and greaves. Hoplites advanced, their overlapping shields creating an impenetrable wall of wood and metal. When two phalanxes collided on the battlefield, the result was a ferocious clash of flesh and steel. Men stabbed and hacked at each other with spears and swords. In a desperate bid to break through the enemy line, the air rang with the clang of metal on metal, the grunts of exertion and the agonized screams of the dying. In this hellish crucible, there was no room for mercy or quarter. Hoplites fought not as individuals, but as a single organism bound by iron discipline and sheer force of will. To break ranks or flee was to invite disaster, dooming the entire formation to collapse and slaughter. The stakes of these confrontations could not have been higher, for defeat often meant the total destruction of a city-state. Victorious armies would raze villages to the ground, slaughtering or enslaving entire populations. In a frenzy of bloodlust, the conquered survivors faced a grim choice between death and a life of abject servitude. One of the most notorious examples of this pitiless logic was the Athenian siege of the island city of Melos. In 416 BC, the Melians, who had tried to remain neutral in the Peloponnesian War, were given a stark ultimatum by the Athenians: surrender and pay tribute, or be annihilated. When the Melians refused, the Athenians unleashed a brutal assault, enslaving the women and children and massacring every man of military age. The once prosperous city was reduced to a smoking ruin, its people scattered to the winds or condemned to a life of bondage. The fate of Melos was a chilling demonstration of the savagery that lurked beneath the surface of Greek civilization. It laid bare the ruthless calculus of power that governed relations between city-states, where the strong devoured the weak, and the only law was that of the sword. Yet even as we recoil at such barbarity, we must also confront the uncomfortable truth that it was this very savagery that fueled so many of ancient Greece's most enduring accomplishments. The wealth and glory of Athens in particular was built on a foundation of conquest, slavery, and slaughter. Nowhere was this dark symbiosis more apparent than in the famous Athenian campaign against Syracuse in 415 BC. At the height of its power, Athens launched a massive invasion of the Sicilian city, seeking to expand its empire and crush a potential rival. Leading the expedition was the dashing and charismatic Alcibiades, a brilliant general and orator who embodied both the best and worst of Athenian society: handsome, wealthy, and ambitious. Alcibiades was a master manipulator who ultimately charmed and bullied his way to the top of the political hierarchy. But for all his gifts, Alcibiades was also a man consumed by hubris and haunted by scandal. On the very eve of the Sicilian campaign, he was accused of drunkenly desecrating sacred statues throughout Athens. Faced with a trial and possible execution, Alcibiades fled to Athens' mortal enemy Sparta, where he promptly began plotting his former city's downfall. Without its most talented commander, the Athenian invasion of Syracuse soon descended into disaster. The Athenians found themselves trapped and besieged in a foreign land, their supply lines cut and their morale shattered. In a desperate bid to break out, they launched a massive naval assault on the Syracusan harbor. What followed was one of the bloodiest and most tragic battles of the ancient world. Hundreds of triumphs rammed and grappled with each other in the narrow confines of the harbor, while hoplites fought hand on the decks above. The water ran red with blood, and the air was thick with smoke, and the screams of the dying. When the carnage was over, the once invincible Athenian navy lay in ruins. Tens of thousands of Athenian soldiers and sailors were captured, tortured, and worked to death in Syracuse stone quarries. The shattered remnants of the expedition limped back to Athens, their dreams of empire dashed and their city's fate sealed. The Sicilian disaster marked the beginning of the end for Athens and the golden age it represented. Never again would the city recapture its former glory or wield such power over the Greek world. In the end, its reach had exceeded its grasp, and its brilliant light had been snuffed out by the very darkness it sought to conquer. As we contemplate the grim fate of the Athenian expedition and the savage realities of Greek warfare, we are reminded once again of the terrible cost of hubris and the folly of unchecked ambition. The Athenians, like so many conquerors before and since, thought themselves invincible only to be humbled by the pitiless logic of war. Their story is a cautionary tale for all those who would seek to dominate others through force and terror. It reminds us that no civilization, no matter how advanced or enlightened, is immune to the seductive pull of power and the madness of crowds. And yet, even in the midst of such darkness, we can still find glimmers of humanity and resilience. The Athenian soldiers who fought and died on the shores of Sicily were not faceless cogs in a machine, but living, breathing individuals with hopes and dreams of their own. In their final moments, they showed the same courage and loyalty that had made Athens great, even as their leaders led them to ruin. Their sacrifice, however futile, speaks to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. As we grapple with the legacy of Greek warfare and the uncomfortable truths it reveals about the human condition, we must also hold fast to this spirit of resilience and self-reflection. We must be willing to confront the darkness within ourselves and our societies. Even the incredible mind of Aristotle seems to have known no bounds. Born in 384 BCE in Stera, a small town on the northern coast of Greece, Aristotle's intellect and curiosity would carry him far beyond the confines of his humble birthplace. As the son of the personal physician to King Idas of Macedon, Aristotle's early life granted him a fortunate head start. At the age of 17, he journeyed to Athens to study at Plato's renowned academy. Here, among the olive groves and marble colonnades, Aristotle immersed himself in philosophy, mathematics, and the natural sciences. His agile mind quickly distinguished him as one of the Academy's most brilliant pupils. For nearly 20 years, Aristotle remained at the Academy, engaging in vigorous debates with his fellow students, and even with Plato himself. While Aristotle deeply admired his teacher, he was not afraid to challenge Plato's ideas and develop his own groundbreaking theories. Aristotle's interests spanned an astonishing range of subjects, from biology and physics to ethics, politics, and metaphysics. He was a true polymath in every sense of the word. After Plato's death in 347 BCE, Aristotle embarked on his own philosophical journey. He traveled to the city of Assos, where he studied marine biology and married the adoptive daughter of the city's ruler. A few years later, Aristotle received an invitation that would change the course of history. His former pupil, Philip II of Macedon, asked Aristotle to return to Macedon to tutor his young son, a boy named Alexander. For several years, Aristotle mentored the bright and energetic prince, teaching him philosophy, politics, and the arts of rhetoric and debate. While we can only speculate about the details of their lessons, there is no doubt that Aristotle played a profound role in shaping the intellect and worldview of the young Alexander. The depth of their bond is reflected in a famous quote attributed to Alexander I. As Alexander grew into a formidable leader and set out to conquer the known world, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school called the Lyceum. Here he wrote extensively on a vast array of subjects and delivered lectures to eager students. Aristotle's methods were a departure from those of Plato's Academy. Rather than focusing on abstract ideas alone, Aristotle emphasized empirical observation and logical reasoning. Aristotle collected samples, conducted experiments, and meticulously categorized his findings. His surviving works stand as a testament to his far-reaching genius. In his treatises on the natural sciences, he laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the modern scientific method. His studies of plants and animals were unrivaled for centuries, and in philosophy, he grappled with fundamental questions of existence, knowledge, and ethics. His concept of the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies in moderation between extremes, remains profoundly influential even today. Yet even Aristotle could not escape the turbulent politics of ancient Greece. After the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, anti-Macedonian sentiment surged in Athens. Aristotle, perceived as being too close to the Macedonian court, faced charges of impiety. Unwilling to let Athens repeat the tragedy that befell Socrates, he chose exile, fleeing to the island of Euboea. There, in the ancient town of Chalcis, he lived out his final year. Aristotle's story reminds us that even in a world as harsh and unforgiving as ancient Greece, the light of knowledge and understanding could still shine. His ideas endured long after his death, sparking debates among philosophers and scientists for over 2 millennia. Today, Aristotle is remembered as one of the most brilliant and influential minds in human history, a shining example of how curiosity and intellect can illuminate the darkness and leave a legacy that resonates through time. As we conclude our journey through the brutal realities of ancient Greek life, it is worth reflecting on the incredible resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit. From the back-breaking labor of farmers to the blood-soaked battlefields of hoplite warfare, the ancient Greeks endured unimaginable hardships. Yet, even amidst such suffering, they created art, philosophy, and literature that continue to captivate us today. Perhaps there is a lesson in their example. Even in our darkest moments, we possess the strength to persevere and the capacity for greatness. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander through the olive groves, sun-dappled hills, and marble halls of ancient Greece, secure in the knowledge that you are part of a grand and enduring human story. And if this journey through history has captured your imagination, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are countless more tales to uncover and wisdom to glean from the annals of human civilization. Join us again for another voyage into the past, where the struggles and triumphs of our ancestors may illuminate our own lives today. But for now, close your eyes, let your mind be still, and slip gently into the warm embrace of sleep.